The letter showed up on a Tuesday morning, tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket, which I thought was already a pretty bold move considering my truck was parked in my own driveway. It was January. The temperature was hovering somewhere around 12 degrees, and the wind coming off the open fields behind our subdivision was the kind of wind that makes your face feel like it's being sandblasted with tiny ice crystals. I had just come outside in my bathrobe and boots to grab the newspaper. Yes, I still get a physical newspaper, don't judge me, when I spotted the white envelope flapping against my wiper blade. I pulled it free, my fingers going numb almost immediately, and flipped it over. On the front, in that very particular font that HOA correspondence always seems to use, the kind that looks professional but somehow also looks smug, it read, "Formal Notice Cedarbrook Hollow Homeowners Association." I stood there in my driveway in the freezing cold for a solid 10 seconds just staring at it. My breath came out in thick clouds. My boots were already getting soaked through because I hadn't laced them properly. And somewhere deep in my gut I already knew, before I'd even broken the seal, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to ruin the rest of my week. My name is Pete Wallace. I've lived in the Cedarbrook Hollow subdivision for going on 9 years now. I bought my house because I liked the neighborhood, liked the mature trees lining the streets, liked the fact that my backyard backed up to a small nature preserve. What I did not fully appreciate at the time of purchase was that Cedarbrook Hollow came with a homeowners association that was, to put it charitably, enthusiastic about its authority. And at the center of that authority, operating like a kind of self-appointed monarch of our little residential kingdom, was a woman named Joan Vandermeer. Joan Vandermeer was the HOA board's vice president of community standards, which was a title so grandiose it would be funny if Joan didn't take it so absolutely, completely seriously. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed even when it was 15 degrees outside, and she had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making every interaction feel like you were being called into the principal's office. She'd been on the board for 6 years running. Nobody really ran against her because nobody wanted to deal with the consequences of running against her. I'd personally watched her send 14 letters to one neighbor over the color of his mailbox post. 14. Over a mailbox post. So when I saw that HOA envelope under my wiper, I already had Joan Vandermeer's face in my mind. I just didn't know yet how spectacularly bad this particular situation was going to get. I went back inside, poured myself a coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened the letter. The radiator in the corner was ticking and clanking like it always does in January, working overtime to keep the house warm, and the windows were fogged at the edges from the cold outside pressing against the glass. I smoothed the letter out on the table and started reading. The letter informed me, and I'm paraphrasing here, because the original used approximately 400 more words than it needed to, that the Cedarbrook Hollow HOA had recently established a community-wide snow removal and ice management program in partnership with a company called Pristine Pathways Property Services. This new program, the letter said, would ensure uniform and timely snow removal across all driveways and walkways within the community, promoting neighborhood aesthetic and safety standards. Starting February 1st, all homeowners would be required to cancel any existing private snow removal arrangements and enroll in the HOA's new program. The cost would be added to our HOA dues. Failure to comply would result in fines. I read it twice, then a third time because I genuinely thought I was misreading something. I was not misreading anything. The HOA was trying to force me to cancel my private snow removal contract, a contract I had held with a local guy named Danny Kowalski for the past 4 years, and instead pay for their preferred vendor, Pristine Pathways Property Services, through my HOA dues. The amount they were proposing to add to dues was $140 per month, from November through March. That's $700 per season. My contract with Danny. $65 a month, flat rate, unlimited plowing. And he was here every single time it snowed, usually before I even woke up. Danny ran a small operation, just him and two other guys with pickup trucks and plows, and he was the most reliable human being I had ever encountered in my life. The man had shown up during a blizzard 2 years ago when we got 18 inches overnight and had my driveway clear by 5 a.m. so I could get to work. He sent text updates. He checked in. He was, in every meaningful sense of the word, excellent. I was being asked to pay more than double to drop Danny and sign up with some company I'd never heard of. I picked up my phone and called my neighbor, Greg Torres, who lived 3 houses down. Greg answered on the second ring. "You get the HOA letter?" I asked. "I was literally just about to call you," Greg said. "What the heck is this?" "That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out." Greg had been using his own snow blower for years and didn't have a private contract, but he was still furious because he was going to be billed for the HOA's program regardless. His driveway was already being maintained. He didn't need or want pristine pathways property services anywhere near his property. And yet there it was, $140 a month, mandatory, starting February 1st. We spent about 20 minutes on the phone comparing notes, and the more we talked, the more something felt off about this whole thing. Greg pointed out that he'd never seen any vote or meeting notice about a new community-wide snow removal program. I hadn't either. Our HOA bylaws required a formal member vote for any new assessments above a certain threshold. Neither of us could remember any such vote being held or even proposed. That was when I started pulling out paperwork. I keep pretty good records. I know that sounds boring, but it has saved me more times than I can count. I had my original HOA documents from when I bought the house, plus every bylaw update that had been distributed since then, plus every meeting notice and minutes summary the board had sent out over the years. I dug through the filing cabinet in my home office, the room that doubles as a disaster zone, because it's where I pile everything I intend to deal with later, and found the relevant sections of the Cedarbrook Hollow CC and RS and bylaws. What I found was pretty interesting. According to Section 7, Subsection C of the HOA bylaws, any new community assessment or fee exceeding $50 per month per household required approval by a simple majority of the membership at a duly noticed general meeting. The notice for such a meeting had to be sent at least 21 days in advance. There had been no such notice. There had been no such meeting. There had been, as far as I could tell, absolutely nothing except Joan Vandermeer deciding this was happening and sending a letter to every homeowner in the subdivision. I also noticed, and this was the part that really made my eyebrows go up, that the letter was signed not by the HOA's president, a relatively reasonable man named Howard Chen, but by Joan Vandermeer herself, in her capacity as Vice President of Community Standards. Which was interesting, because vice presidents of community standards don't typically have unilateral authority to implement new mandatory fee programs. I called Greg back and told him what I'd found. "So she just made this up," he said. "Looks like it," I said. "Without a vote. Without a vote." There was a pause. "Pete," Greg said, "I think Joan Vandermeer has lost her mind." I wasn't sure it was a new development, but I took his point. Over the next 2 days, the neighborhood was buzzing. I'm not exaggerating when I say that within 48 hours of those letters going out, practically every homeowner in Cedarbrook Hollow was either texting each other, stopping each other in driveways, or gathering in small clusters on the sidewalk, bundled in parkas and scarves, because it was still brutally cold to compare notes and express varying levels of outrage. A woman named Patris down on the east end of the subdivision had a contract with the same landscaping company that did her lawn in summer, and they handled her snow removal in winter. A retired couple, the Nuyens, had hired their next-door neighbor's teenage son to shovel their walk and driveway, which worked out perfectly for everyone. A handful of other households were in arrangements similar to mine. All of them were now being told to cancel those arrangements and pay more than twice as much for a service they hadn't asked for. The weather during those 2 days didn't help anyone's mood. We'd gotten another 3 inches on Wednesday night, and Danny, true to form, had been at my driveway at 4:30 in the morning. I'd looked out my bedroom window, bleary-eyed, and seen his truck's amber lights flashing through the dark and the falling snow, and thought about how much I did not want to lose this arrangement. Meanwhile, I heard from Greg that Pristine Pathways Property Services had done a sample run on the HOA's common areas the previous week, and 2 of the board members who lived near those areas had complained that the job was mediocre at best. One of them told Greg off the record that the plow operator had left a good 8 inches of packed snow at the base of everyone's mailbox and hadn't put down any ice melt. So not only was Joan trying to force us all into a worse deal, she was trying to force us into a demonstrably worse deal. I started asking around quietly about Pristine Pathways Property Services. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by nature, but the whole thing just smelled bad. The company wasn't local. They were based about 40 miles away in a larger city, and their online reviews were, let's say, mixed. 3 stars on one platform, 2.5 on another. Lots of complaints about inconsistent service and billing disputes. I couldn't find any obvious public connection between the company and Joan Vandermeer, but I also didn't have access to corporate records, so I filed that away for later. What I did find, through a friend of a friend who worked in commercial real estate, was that Pristine Pathways Property Services had recently been expanding aggressively into suburban HOA contracts, specifically targeting HOAs where a single influential board member could be persuaded to push the contract through. My friend's contact mentioned, without naming names, that Pristine Pathways sometimes offered referral incentives to HOA board members who helped secure community contracts. Referral incentives. I let that phrase sit in my brain for a while. I decided it was time to get organized. Greg and I put together a simple email. I drafted it, Greg cleaned it up, and we sent it to every homeowner in the subdivision whose email address we had, which was about 60% of the neighborhood. We explained what we'd found about the bylaw requirements, noted the absence of any proper vote, and invited everyone to a casual meeting at my house the following Saturday afternoon. I figured if 20 people showed up, I'd consider it a success. 34 people showed up. My living room was absolutely packed. I'd pushed the furniture back as far as it could go, and people were standing in the hallway and spilling into the dining room. It was one of those chaotic, slightly too warm gatherings where someone's dog is weaving between everyone's legs and 3 conversations are happening at once. I had a fire going in the fireplace because it was 9 degrees outside, and people kept coming in from the cold with red cheeks and frost on their jacket collars, and someone had brought a massive batch of chili because apparently that's what you do in January when you're furious at your HOA. I went over everything I'd found, the bylaw requirements, the missing vote, the timeline. Several other neighbors had done their own digging and added to the pile. One woman, a retired paralegal named Sandra Kowalczyk, had already been in contact with a real estate attorney friend of hers who confirmed that what Joan had done was almost certainly a procedural violation of the HOA's own governing documents. Sandra was calm, precise, and slightly terrifying in the best possible way. She had printed handouts. She had a clipboard. Another neighbor, a tech guy named Marcus Webb, had pulled up Pristine Pathways Property Services state business registration and found something interesting. The company had only been registered in our state for 14 months. Their listed agent was a law firm in the city. Nothing about this was technically illegal, but it added to the picture of a company that had materialized fairly recently and was now being shoved into a mandatory contract with our entire subdivision. The mood in my living room was a combination of genuinely angry and almost entertainingly indignant. People were sharing stories about previous run-ins with Joan. the mailbox letter saga came up. There was the time Joan had fined someone for keeping a holiday wreath on their door until January 8th, which she deemed past the acceptable seasonal decoration window. There was the ongoing drama about the family on Birchwood Court who had been cited for parking their RV in their own side yard, even though the HOA documents didn't technically prohibit it. Joan had just decided it was unsightly and started sending fines. Joan's power had been quietly expanding for years, and most people had either ignored it or paid the fines to make it go away. This, apparently, was the thing that finally crossed enough lines to make 34 people show up in January to eat chili and talk about HOA documents. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. Sandra was going to draft a formal letter to the full HOA board, not just Joan, but every board member, citing the specific bylaw violations, and demanding that the February 1st mandatory enrollment requirement be suspended pending a proper membership vote. We'd collect signatures from every homeowner who wanted to sign it, which turned out to be 41 people over the next 3 days. Greg was going to reach out directly to Howard Chen, the HOA president, because Greg had always had a decent relationship with Howard and figured a quiet conversation might be productive. And I was going to do a little more digging into the Pristine Pathways situation. I also called Danny and told him what was happening. Danny was quiet for a moment and then said, "Pete, just so you know, nobody is canceling your contract but you. I'll keep plowing your driveway as long as you want me to." I appreciated that more than I told him. The temperature dropped even further that week. We hit -7 on Thursday morning, and there was a water main break 2 streets over that left a section of Maplecroft Drive completely iced over for most of the day. Half the neighborhood was slipping around, and the roads in the subdivision weren't getting any better because the HOA-maintained streets depended on a plowing service that, based on what people were telling me, showed up later than promised and didn't lay enough ice melt. Meanwhile, private contractors, Danny and a couple of other guys working other properties, had their clients' driveways done before breakfast. Sandra sent the formal letter on Friday. It was impressive. It was 4 pages long, with specific bylaw citations, a timeline of events demonstrating the absence of proper notice and vote procedures, and a formal demand that the board either call a properly noticed membership meeting to vote on the new assessment or immediately rescind the February 1st mandatory enrollment requirement. It was signed by 41 homeowners. Howard Chen received a personal copy via certified mail. Joan Vandermeer received a personal copy via certified mail. Every other board member received a personal copy via certified mail. Joan's response was not to rescind anything. Joan's response was to send a second letter. This one was addressed to me specifically, Pete Wallace, and it informed me that I was in violation of the HOA's community harmony standards for allegedly organizing opposition activities against the board, and that I was being assessed a fine of $250. It also stated that my private snow removal contractor was operating without HOA authorization on community streets, and that I needed to cease allowing him access to my property via those streets immediately. I read that letter and I actually laughed out loud, not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so over the top that laughter was the only logical response. Joan had just tried to fine me for having neighbors over for chili. She'd also apparently forgotten that the streets in Cedarbrook Hollow were public roads maintained by the county, not private HOA-controlled streets, and Danny Kowalski had every legal right to drive a truck down them. I scanned the letter, emailed it to Sandra, and typed 3 words. She did it again. Sandra called me within 10 minutes. "This is actually perfect," she said, and I could hear the restrained glee in her voice. "She's retaliating against you for exercising your legal right to communicate with fellow homeowners and organize a petition. That's a potential violation of your First Amendment rights. And before you say anything, yes, I know HOAs are private entities, but our state has specific statutes protecting homeowner association members from retaliatory fines. I've been looking at this. She rattled off a state statute number that I immediately wrote down. I also consulted my Ring doorbell footage and the security camera I had mounted on the side of my garage, which covered the driveway and a decent chunk of the street. I reviewed the footage from the morning. The original HOA letter had appeared under my windshield wiper. What I saw was interesting. It was Joan Vandermeer at 6:14 a.m. in a long wool coat and a hat, walking up my driveway and tucking the letter under my wiper blade. She then walked to the next house and the next, making her way down the street. I could see her breath clouding in the cold air. She was very systematic about it. There was nothing necessarily illegal about delivering letters on foot, but the footage confirmed that Joan had personally delivered these letters herself, rather than mailing them through any formal HOA process, which Sandra noted was itself a procedural irregularity under the HOA's own communication protocols, which required formal notices to be sent via U.S. mail with postage paid from the HOA account. I downloaded the footage and saved it in 3 places. The week before February 1st, things started getting genuinely interesting. Greg had his conversation with Howard Chen, and Howard, who it turned out had been kept largely in the dark about the specifics of the Pristine Pathways deal, was not pleased. According to Greg, Howard said he'd been told the new snow removal program was a voluntary upgrade option that would be marketed to interested homeowners. He had not authorized a mandatory enrollment program with a fine for noncompliance. He had not been shown the letter that went out to homeowners. He had not signed it because Joan had signed it herself. Howard Chen, as it happened, was now very interested in having his own conversation with Joan Vandermeer. I found out the next piece of the puzzle through Marcus Webb, who had continued digging into Pristine Pathways. Marcus was thorough. He'd found an LLC registered in a neighboring state that listed a property management consulting company as a member, and that consulting company, buried under 2 more layers of corporate registration, had a connection to a name that appeared in our HOA's own financial records. Not Joan's name directly, but the name of her brother-in-law, a man named Carl Fenton, who apparently did some kind of business development work in the property management space. We couldn't prove Joan was personally profiting from the Pristine Pathways contract. Not yet. But there was enough of a trail to make the connection look very uncomfortable. Marcus printed everything out in a neatly organized binder. It was 42 pages long. He handed me a copy and kept one for himself. I also sent a digital copy to Sandra, he said. Sandra, when she got it, used the word actionable in a way that suggested she was having a very good day. We formally requested a special membership meeting under the HOA bylaws. Our state law, Sandra confirmed, required the HOA board to call a special meeting within 30 days if at least 20% of homeowners submitted a signed written request. We had 41 signatures, which was well above 20% of our roughly 160 household subdivision. Howard Chen, as board president, agreed to facilitate the meeting. He set the date for the last Saturday in January, giving the required notice period. Joan Vandermeer apparently did not take this well. 2 people told me she'd been going door to door in the neighborhood trying to drum up support for the new program, pitching it as a safety upgrade and a way to professionalize the community aesthetic. One neighbor told me Joan had shown up at his door with a glossy brochure for Pristine Pathways and had told him that homeowners who didn't comply with the new program were undermining neighborhood property values. He'd listened politely, thanked her, and then texted me about it immediately. Joan also appeared to be trying to intimidate people. Not in any dramatic way, but in that particular HOA way where suddenly, after years of no issues, 3 or 4 neighbors who had been vocal about opposing the new program started receiving compliance notices for things like slightly uneven flag placement, a recycling bin that had been left at the curb, an hour past the approved retrieval window, and a car parked on a driveway apron in a way that apparently violated a subsection of the parking regulations nobody had known existed. All of these notices were signed by Joan Vandermeer, Vice President of Community Standards. Sandra collected all of them. She was building quite the file. It snowed again the Thursday before the meeting. A solid 8 inches came down overnight and into Friday morning. Danny was at my driveway at 4:45 a.m. and had it clean within 20 minutes. I got up and made coffee and watched through the kitchen window as he finished up, the amber lights of his truck moving steadily in the blue-gray pre-dawn. A couple of streets over, I found out later, the Pristine Pathways truck hadn't shown up until almost 10 a.m. And when it did, it managed to plow a ridge of snow directly across the bottom of several driveways, so that homeowners stepped out their front doors into a solid wall of packed snow they then had to dig through by hand just to get to their cars. One of those homeowners, a man named Dave Burkett, who had initially been neutral on the whole controversy, sent me a furious text at 10:45 a.m. that simply said, "I am coming to that meeting on Saturday and I am bringing photos." He was not the only one. Saturday arrived gray and bitter cold. The community center the HOA used for meetings, a room in a local church that they rented, was heated by a gas furnace that the building manager warned us had been acting up in the extreme cold. The furnace was fine, as it turned out, but it served as a kind of ambient reminder that January in our part of the country was not playing games. People arrived bundled up, clutching thermoses, finding seats in folding chairs arranged in rows. The room filled up faster than any HOA meeting I'd ever heard of in our subdivision's history. By the time Howard Chen called the meeting to order at 2 p.m., there were at least 90 homeowners present, and a few more standing along the walls. Joan Vandermeer was there, seated in the front row at the board table, dressed impeccably as always, a slight frozen smile quality to her expression that I'd learned over the years meant she was calculating something. Howard ran a tight ship. He went through the agenda, acknowledged the petition, and immediately opened the floor to discussion of the proposed mandatory snow removal assessment. He explained, clearly and without editorializing, that he had not been aware the program had been presented as mandatory, and that a proper member vote had not been conducted prior to the notices being sent. Joan tried to interject. Howard, very calmly, told her she'd have her opportunity to speak. Sandra presented our case. She was methodical, precise, and exactly as effective as I'd expected. She walked through the bylaw requirements, the procedural violations, the retaliatory fines, and the overall pattern of the last 3 weeks. She referenced specific document sections by number and subsection. She had handouts for everyone. Watching her work was honestly a pleasure. Then Dave Burkett stood up and showed the photos on his phone of what Pristine Pathways had done to his driveway. Several other people shared similar stories. A woman from the east side of the neighborhood described calling Pristine Pathways customer service line 3 times on Friday morning, and being put on hold for a total of 45 minutes before reaching a person who told her, and I quote, that her service area had been deprioritized due to weather conditions. In a snowstorm. A snow removal company had deprioritized her during a snowstorm. The room's collective blood pressure was palpable. Marcus Webb stood up and gave a clear, calm summary of what he'd found about the connections between Pristine Pathways and the LLC, with links to Joan's brother-in-law. He was careful. He didn't say Joan had done anything criminal. He said there appeared to be a conflict of interest, that the board had an obligation to disclose and investigate. He put his 42-page binder on the table in front of Howard Chen. Howard looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Joan. Joan said, "Those are unverified claims from people who clearly have an agenda." Howard said, "Joan, where did this contract come from? Who initiated the conversation with Pristine Pathways?" There was a pause that lasted probably 4 seconds but felt considerably longer. "I did the research," Joan said. I identified a vendor that could improve our community services, who approved entering into a contract negotiation with them. Another pause. I brought it to the board. I don't have any record of that, Howard said. Do either of our other board members? The two other board members present a quiet man named Phil Osborne and a woman named Rita Castillo. Both shook their heads. Rita added, I was told it was exploratory. Howard turned back to Joan. Joan, did you sign a contract with Pristine Pathways on behalf of the HOA? Joan straightened in her chair. I executed a letter of intent. The room erupted. Howard had to raise his voice to bring it back to order, which he did effectively. A letter of intent, he repeated slowly, without board authorization, and then sent mandatory enrollment notices to the entire membership, and proposed a new fee assessment without a member vote. Joan opened her mouth. Howard held up a hand. I'm going to need to see all documentation related to this before we go any further. Phil, Rita, are you both agreed that this program should be suspended pending full board review and a proper membership vote? Both of them said yes immediately. Joan said, You can't just. Howard said, Joan, the program is suspended. We'll deal with the rest through proper channels. The membership vote on the suspension came back overwhelmingly in favor. People were raising their hands before Howard even finished asking the question. Joan sat very still at the table, looking like someone who had just watched a carefully constructed sandcastle get washed away by a wave she hadn't seen coming. I'll be honest, there was a part of me that felt something almost like sympathy. Almost. And then I remembered the $250 retaliatory fine she tried to levy on me for having neighbors over for chili, and the sympathy evaporated very quickly. In the following days, things moved faster than I expected. Howard formally requested all documentation from Joan related to the Pristine Pathways arrangement. What came out of that review was worse than most of us had anticipated. The letter of intent Joan had signed committed the HOA to a minimum 2-year contract with Pristine Pathways at a rate of $12,000 per season. She had signed it without board authorization, without legal review, and without member approval. The letter of intent included a clause that, if the HOA failed to execute the full contract, would trigger a penalty fee of $8,000. Howard immediately engaged the HOA's attorney, a real estate lawyer based in town, who reviewed the documents and determined that the letter of intent was not legally binding because Joan had lacked the authority to execute it on the HOA's behalf. The attorney sent a formal rescission letter to Pristine Pathways. Pristine Pathways, to nobody's great surprise, threatened to sue for the penalty fee anyway. Their lawyer sent a letter. Our lawyer sent a letter back that was, by all accounts, fairly withering. Pristine Pathways ultimately didn't pursue it, probably because doing so would have required them to demonstrate that they'd entered a valid contract with an unauthorized signatory, which was a hard case to make. The conflict of interest question was thornier. Marcus's documentation showed a plausible but indirect financial connection between Pristine Pathways and Joan's brother-in-law. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to warrant serious scrutiny. Howard, at Sandra's recommendation, sent the full package to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which had jurisdiction over HOA governance complaints in our state, and also filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Regulatory Board, which oversaw HOA management practices. The investigations didn't move fast. Government investigations never do, but they moved. Both agencies confirmed receipt and assigned case numbers within 2 weeks. Joan Vandermeer, meanwhile, had gone very quiet. She stopped attending the informal board check-ins Howard had been holding. She stopped sending compliance notices. She did not appear at the mailboxes or knock on doors or leave any more letters under any windshield wipers. The general consensus in the neighborhood was that she'd gotten advice, possibly legal advice, to stop talking. At a formal board meeting 3 weeks after the big membership meeting, Joan Vandermeer resigned from the Cedarbrook Hollow HOA board. Her resignation letter, which Howard read aloud per procedural requirement, was 3 sentences long and cited personal reasons and shifting priorities. There was no acknowledgement of anything that had happened, no apology, no explanation. Rita Castillo moved to accept the resignation. Phil seconded. It passed unanimously. The room, smaller this time, just the board and about 15 regular meeting attendees, was quiet for a moment after Howard announced the acceptance. Then someone started clapping, which spread around the room, and Howard made a visible effort to maintain his composure as the chair of a professional governance body rather than the person who was clearly also feeling some relief. The $250 retaliatory fine Joan had levied against me was reversed at the same meeting. The compliance notices sent to the neighbors who'd been vocal opponents of the program were also formally invalidated. Sandra had filed written objections for each one, citing the retaliation statute she'd identified earlier, and the board accepted them without argument. Joan's brother-in-law Carl Fenton's connection to Pristine Pathways, as it turned out, went deeper than the corporate registration trail had initially shown. When the state attorney general's office started pulling threads, they found that Fenton had a direct referral arrangement with Pristine Pathways, a 10% kickback on any HOA contract he helped secure. Fenton had allegedly worked through Joan to approach Cedarbrook Hollow. Joan, in turn, had allegedly received cash payments from Fenton totaling around $3,000 over the previous 3 months in exchange for pushing the contract through. That part crossed from HOA drama into actual criminal territory. I got a call from a state investigator in late February. A polite, businesslike woman who asked me questions about the timeline, asked me to email her copies of the letters and the meeting minutes, and asked about the security camera footage of Joan delivering the letters at 6 a.m. I emailed everything to her that same afternoon. Marcus Webb got a similar call. Sandra got 2 calls. Greg got 1. In early March, Joan Vandermeer and Carl Fenton were charged with a misdemeanor count of breach of fiduciary duty under our state's HOA governance statute, and a separate charge related to the undisclosed financial arrangement, essentially receiving undisclosed compensation in connection with a fiduciary role. It wasn't a federal crime or anything that was going to land anyone in prison for years, but it was real criminal charges, real court dates, and real consequences. Joan's attorney apparently negotiated a plea arrangement over the following months that involved a fine, restitution to the HOA for legal costs, and a formal prohibition on Joan serving in any HOA governance role in our state for the next 7 years. Fenton's arrangement was separate but similar in structure. Neither of them served jail time, which some neighbors thought was too lenient, but Sandra pointed out that for a first-time white-collar misdemeanor with a restitution agreement, it was actually a meaningful consequence, and the 7-year bar on HOA governance was genuinely significant for someone like Joan, whose entire identity had apparently been wrapped up in that role. For what it's worth, the restitution amount covered all of the HOA's legal fees related to the whole mess, plus the filing fees for the regulatory complaints, plus a small buffer that went into the HOA's reserve fund. The HOA actually came out financially whole, which was more than I'd expected. Back on the day-to-day practical side of things, Danny Kowalski continued to plow my driveway every single time it snowed for the rest of that winter. We had 3 more significant snowfalls after all the drama wound down, and Danny was there for every one of them. February brought a particularly nasty ice storm that coated everything in a 1/4 inch of clear ice, the kind that's invisible until you step on it and your feet go out from under you, and Danny was out at 5 a.m. putting down sand and ice melt, doing the whole driveway and the walkway to my front door. I made him a thermos of coffee and left it in the mailbox with a thank you note. He texted me to say it was the best mid-storm coffee he'd ever had. The HOA, under Howard's leadership, and with a newly reconstituted board that included Sandra Kowalczyk and Marcus Webb as new elected members, adopted a formal policy about snow removal. The policy was sensible. Homeowners could maintain their own private snow removal arrangements or opt into a community program if one was ever established. But that program would require a proper member vote, competitive bidding with disclosed pricing, and a complete conflict of interest disclosure from any board member involved in the selection process. It was the kind of governance policy that should have existed all along but hadn't, because nobody had thought it necessary until Joan Vandermeer demonstrated exactly why it was necessary. The neighborhood also started using a group text chain that Greg had set up during the whole ordeal, and it never really went away. People used it to share weather updates, road condition reports, recommendations for local contractors, and occasional photos of particularly spectacular snow formations in their yards. It was, in an unexpected way, the most community-building thing that had come out of the entire disaster. We knew each other better by the end of that winter than we had in years. One morning in late February, a couple of weeks after Joan's resignation, and a few days before the charges were announced, I was out shoveling the light snow that Danny's truck couldn't quite get right at the front edge of my steps. There's always that little patch, and Greg came walking up the street with his dog. He stopped at the end of my driveway and we stood there in the cold for a few minutes, watching the dog investigate a snow pile near my mailbox. "So how does it feel?" Greg asked. "How does what feel?" "The whole thing, everything." I thought about it for a second. "Honestly, I'm just glad I kept the paperwork." Greg laughed. "That's very you, Pete." "I'm a very me person," I said. The dog pulled Greg toward the next yard and he waved as he went. I went back to shoveling. It was cold, my breath was fogging, and my fingers were complaining through my gloves, but my driveway was clean, and my contract with Danny was intact, and the HOA, for the first time in a long time, was being run by people who understood that authority comes with accountability attached. The furnace inside was running steadily. The coffee I'd left on the counter was still warm. And whatever Joan Vandermeer had imagined she was building for herself with that pristine pathways scheme, the influence, the side money, the expanded power over a neighborhood she'd apparently decided she owned, it was gone, scattered like snow and wind, and none of it was coming back. I finished shoveling the front steps, went inside, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. Through the kitchen window I could see the street, clean and clear, the morning light bouncing off packed snow at the edges of the road. Danny's tracks were still visible in a thin skim of fresh snow across the driveway. $65 a month. Best money I spent all winter. The community center where we'd held that packed Saturday meeting was booked again for the spring governance meeting in April. Howard had sent out the notice 3 weeks in advance, via U.S. mail, with postage paid from the HOA account, in full compliance with every procedural requirement in the bylaws. The agenda included the election of permanent replacements for the vacant board seats, the spring budget review, and a new standing item Howard had personally added, a conflict of interest disclosure requirement for all board members, to be completed annually, covering any financial relationships with vendors doing business with the HOA. Sandra had helped draft the language. It was thorough. It closed every loophole Joan had exploited, and a few that nobody had thought of exploiting yet. I went to that April meeting. I don't usually go to HOA meetings, most people don't, which is kind of how these problems start in the first place, but I went to this one. The room was about half full, which for a voluntary HOA governance meeting is actually quite good. Howard ran it efficiently. The new board members were confirmed, including Sandra and Marcus. The budget was discussed and approved. The conflict of interest policy passed unanimously. After the meeting, while people were putting on their coats and filtering out into the cool April evening, not warm yet, spring arriving slowly and reluctantly the way it always does in our part of the country, Howard stopped me near the door. "Pete," he said, I want to say thank you, officially and personally. I just read the bylaws, I said. He smiled. More people should. He wasn't wrong about that either. On the drive home, I passed Danny's truck going the other direction. He was heading back from a late job, not snow. Obviously, it was April, but he ran a landscaping operation in the warmer months and had been busy with the season's first cleanup jobs. I waved and he honked twice. Short, friendly honks. My street looked quiet and normal when I pulled in. Houses lit up from inside, cars in driveways. A few patches of stubborn gray snow still clinging to the shadowed edges of yards where the sun hadn't reached all the way yet. Just a regular neighborhood, doing what regular neighborhoods do, which is mostly getting on with daily life without anyone trying to shake them down for a mandatory snow removal contract with a company connected to someone's brother-in-law. I went inside, fed the dog, checked my email, saw a new message from Sandra with the subject line, AG Office Update, Fenton Restitution Confirmed, and felt, for the first time since January, that everything in Cedarbrook Hollow was properly, genuinely, satisfyingly settled. I made a note to file the AG update in my HOA folder. You never know when you'll need documentation. And I kept Danny's number at the top of my contacts list, right where it had always been, right where it was going to stay.